Hello, everybody, and welcome to our South African PowerPoint. We're going to start here by talking about some demographics in South Africa. And as it's an African country, naturally there's going to be a majority ethnic black population. And this is the case in South Africa, where 74% of South Africans are actually ethnically black after World War II. The white population divided between this Afrikaner majority and an English minority is about 15%. The Afrikaners were former Dutch settlers who developed their own sort of language. The English minority, English comes in. The English come in a little bit later. There's also a smaller mixed descent colored population, about 9%, and then there's about 2% of South Africa are actually Indians ethnically after World War II. Of note, you guys know who Mahatma Gandhi is. We talked about him, or at least you read about him in the A Week on India, and he actually studied law in South Africa before he went back to India to lead an independence movement there. So this is just sort of the demographic makeup of South Africa after World War II. And we'll start here, well, not start, we'll continue here by talking about this Afrikaner nationalist party. They actually win independence in 1948 from Great Britain. They're led by this person, Hendrik Verwoerde. It's difficult to pronounce in English. It's a Afrikaans name. That happens in 1948. They are the Nationalist Party. That's what they're called. I've included a clip on the weekly module section of Hendrik van Volder talking about apartheid in Africa, which is going to really backdrop this whole discussion here. So what I want to say about African labor and apartheid is that South Africa experienced their own industrial revolution during World War II. A lot of people flock to cities and start working there in new industries, but they can't live in cities. At least the black majority can't live in cities because of what's known as apartheid. And I know it looks like apartheid, but when you say it, you're supposed to say it like a tide. So that apartheid, it literally translates to mean apartness from Afrikaans to English. And so there are a little bit of parallels here between the United States in the South and South Africa. There's this legal segregation that exists in both places during this whole post-World War II time frame and even before World War II starts. So as part of apartheid, there are laws passed to reinforce this apartness or this apartheid in South Africa. People had to carry around passbooks, and we have some images on the next slide that I'll show you here in a second. So these passbooks, they're kind of like passports, but driver's licenses, if you have to compare them to anything here, which upon request of a policeman had to be presented by most or all black South Africans. There's also this situation where South Africa tried to create homelands for blacks, sort of like the reservation system in the United States with Native Americans. There are roughly 10 major tribal groups in South Africa, and I have a map here in a couple of slides that's going to illustrate sort of the diversity within South Africa. So these homelands were another a part of apartheid, and each group was supposed to be allotted to their own homeland within South Africa. But these kind of come together and create their own police state in South Africa. The colored area on the map that I'm about to show you here, the colored area here is largely unsettled. I mean, so these are not like very densely populated areas, but this, I hope, illustrates where the majority of people of different ethnicities live in South Africa. So you see the whites are mostly on the coastal areas and in the big cities. So here's Pretoria, the capital. There's Johannesburg, the biggest city. Indians are here on the coastlines. Blacks are mostly in this sort of ugly green color. Interestingly, there's a country inside of South Africa that's sort of its own entity. Lesotho is its own country. Swaziland also is its own country. But a lot of this region here is desolate, so it's largely unsettled. So don't let this mislead you in terms of thinking about geography in South Africa. So here's back to sort of the apartness, some demonstration of the apartness here. We see this sometimes in the United States where there's whites only or non-whites, and here in the Afrikaans language, um, for whites or non-whites. So blanc is white there. So here's another one for use by white people only, and it's also in the language. So here's a South African man with his passbook that looks like a driver's license or a passport that we might be a little bit more familiar with in the United States. So there is this long tradition, though, in South Africa of a black freedom movement. The African National Congress gets together as early as 1912 to start talking about this. This is when they form. They are inclusive to all races, this African National Congress. They organize against apartheid. If you have to compare them to anything in the United States, compare them to the NAACP, NAACP. Here's a little story that you might appreciate. I was giving a test in U.S. history one time, and a young lady wrote the end of Lacey Pete as her answer, because that's what she heard me say, because I just sort of go through NAACP. So that's what she heard, so I had to mark it right, but I explained later what it actually was. So if don't mishear me, is what I'm saying. I know I talk kind of fast sometimes. So that's what it would be similar to, though, the African National Congress. By 1955, the African National Congress issues a freedom charter that's available at this link right here that I guess you can't necessarily click on. I will try and include that on the module section, and you can kind of go through it and look and see what they talk about in this freedom charter. As a sort of an opposition group, opposal's not a word, this rival group, the Pan-African Congress, is established in 1959. That was actually promoted by, remember, Kwame Nkrumah from the last PowerPoints, who thought that Africa should be for Africans, sort of meaning the expulsion of white people from the whole continent, or in this case, just the country. Both groups protest throughout the 1950s. They are both protesting against white domination in the apartheid state in South Africa. The biggest of these protests came in what's known as Sharpeville, excuse me, in 1960. It was outside of a police station. The police ended up panicking and shot about 60 people, 60 demonstrators. And in the wake of this, the South African government ends up banning both the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress. So they both were officially banned in South Africa, but they both still continued to exist after the official ban. Both of them had been pretty nonviolent up to this point, both the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress. But Sharpeville, I don't know why I keep saying Sharpeville changes that in their eyes. They both groups kind of get violent. And this is where somebody you might have heard of before, Nelson Mandela, gets involved. He gets involved. He's a member of the African National Congress, and he's captured by the police after the riot at Sharpeville, or the violence at Sharpeville in 1960, and he's put on trial for inciting violence, and he gives kind of a justification for it. And I'm going to include a clip from a movie called I think it's called Long Walk to Freedom, or Mandela, but it's got Idris Elba sort of explaining this justification, saying that he admitted that they were committed to nonviolence, but the nonviolent approach was not working. So he says that's why the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress had resorted to violence. He ends up being sentenced to life after his trial, and he serves about 28 years in jail, and he comes up later as a leader of an independent South Africa, the first black president of South Africa. And so that'll bring us to some protests and armed struggles in South Africa. Mandela and others' arrests and convictions lead to general protests between 1976 and 1977, and this sort of culminates with the death of Stephen Biko in a protest. One of these protests, and riot is a little bit of a misleading term here because it was mostly violence against black South Africans. But the death of Stephen Biko, and he was nobody in particular. I mean, he was just one protester, but he became a symbol. A lot of the world responds to his death negatively, and foreign countries imposed trade sanctions on South Africa in response to Biko's murder, except, though there are some exceptions here, the United States and Great Britain don't impose these sanctions because there's a lot of racism in the United States and Great Britain too. Um, Babigo, he was a leader of the movement. He just wasn't one of the more famous ones. He does become this symbol though after he's killed. And now in terms of South Africa's government, we get this guy P.W. Botha. That's Biko's picture on the right there. P.W. Botha comes to power in 1978. He's there for about a decade. He does attempt to reform South Africa and ends up spending, though, about 10% of the country's GDP on internal security. But apartheid wasn't working super well. Most of the world was working against South African apartheid, and it leads to this situation where chaos is the identifying characteristic of South Africa in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. So P.W. Botha, he ends up instituting martial law, declaring martial law, I should have said, excuse me, to combat the protests, and that is met with limited success. Botha, for his part, wants to reform apartheid, but doesn't want to get rid of it. We can kind of compare him to Khrushchev a little bit. We're going to get into the Soviet Union a little bit more and talk about this because he wants to reform, but he's an old school kind of a guy, so he doesn't want to reform too much. South Africa becomes a nuclear state in the 1980s as well. They develop their own nuclear weapons, but they agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons in 1993, which I think this is one of the few situations in which a state becomes nuclear, but then goes back and gets rid of them. Meanwhile, the next leader, next white leader of South Africa is this guy, F.W. de Klerk. He's in there for about 6 years or so. He's elected the new president and realizes that changes need to be made. So he ends up releasing a bunch of former political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. And after these prisoners are released, a lot of black South Africans want whites removed completely from South Africa, including Nelson Mandela's wife, Minnie. But Nelson Mandela, for his part, wants to see a multiracial state that actually works. So South Africa in 1994 holds free elections, and Nelson Mandela wins the first national elections after apartheid has been reformed and eventually ended. And he becomes president, so he's the first black president of South Africa ever. So he's the first president, the first black ruler of South Africa since colonization began in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so we'll kind of, on the whole, what we say about South Africa is that their system of independence, we had just talked about the independence movements on the rest of the continent, theirs is different because they had a white minority in control of the country, so it made it easier for Great Britain and the Dutch before them. That was a different situation to pull out. So if I was going to ask you on a test or something about decolonization in South Africa, you would say South Africa is different, especially because they had whites in control after before decolonization took place, so that made it easier for the decolonization process. So what I'm going to say about South Africa since apartheid, though, is that it has pretty much become a one-party state. That ANC, the African National Congress, remains mostly unchallenged in most elections. Not to say that they're dictatorial, but they are mostly a one-party state. South Africa, though, is the most advanced country in Africa as a whole, in large part because the decolonization process was so smooth, because of the white majority or the white minority that were in power there. There are still problems of poverty, unemployment, but it is, though, one of the most developed countries across Africa is South Africa. And so that's sort of where we'll end talking about South Africa here. So I appreciate everybody bearing with me. And again, thanks for watching and learning. This is for your benefit too. So I will see you guys next week. All right.